Hello. This podcast is available unedited and ad-free at patreon.com/Hamilton Morris. Each month, I release 3 to 4 new podcasts, and it was Patreon exclusive until recently. Many people contacted me and said they wanted me to figure out a way to make it freely available, and so I decided to accept sponsorship from a few of my friends. One of them is David Rentlin, the founder of a company called Lucy Nicotine. They make nicotine gum, nicotine pouches, nicotine lozenges, some of which are made with synthetic nicotine, which I think is pretty cool. Now, if you don't already use nicotine, I recommend that you don't start. It's habit forming. But if you already do use nicotine products, and especially if you smoke tobacco cigarettes, I can say that this is a cleaner product. And it's also a product that I use personally. If you go to lucy.co and use the code Hamilton, you get 20% off your purchase. Lastly, this podcast is brought to you by Top Tree Herbs, an herbal tea company founded by my friend and pharmacopoeia producer, Soren Shade. This is not a traditional sponsorship in that I'm not receiving any money from them, but Soren is actually a producer on this podcast. They grow their own kratom domestically in Appalachia in a greenhouse, which is very beautiful, and they source leaves internationally, do third-party testing. I've been to the lab where they do the testing. They test for heavy metals and other adulterants, and it's ethically sourced in tea bag form. You can find their teas at toptreeherbs.com. Okay, so this is a long in the making interview with the great Terence Mckenna. There is so much that I wanted to talk with him about, and there's so much to say to this great man that I feel like I only scratched the surface. He truly knows so much, not just because of his very direct involvement with psychedelic history through his relationship with his brother, who had arguably a greater influence on the world of psychedelics than any other single person, especially today. When we talk about somebody like Timothy Leary, it's usually the context of his influence on the 1960s or his past influence. But Terence Mckenna is somebody that is as important or more important now than he was at the height of his career when he was alive. He gained a second life through the internet, and that life is probably going to exist as long as YouTube exists. He's someone that as soon as you become interested in psychedelics, you find out about him and you listen to his videos, and he's able to articulate all of the ill-formed, half-baked ideas that you may or may not have had in a way that feels so beautiful and compelling that there's a reason that he's beloved by all. And I think that with Terence Mckenna, one of the major issues is that people tend to take the things that he said too literally. Whenever I do an interview, someone says, well, what do you think of the stoned ape hypothesis? What do you think of the idea that the government is keeping psychedelics illegal because they understand their ability to dissolve thought structures? What do you think of time wave zero? And my major thought about all of this is that it's poetry. It's not meant to be taken literally. It's not meant to be interrogated as something that is factual or non-factual. These are ideas that are intended to make people think about the world. And on that level, I think that everything that Terence Mckenna did was immensely effective. But behind Mckenna and all of his work was Terence Mckenna, who is toiling away in various labs doing extremely interesting scientific research. In this interview, I talk about the influence of Terence Mckenna on my own scientific trajectory, and it's absolutely true that reading his papers was one of my first introductions outside of Alexander Shulgin to seeing how rigorously the subject could be studied. When people think about the past, they often have a tendency to assume that it was more or less the way things currently are. The 1960s must have been more or less the same. People were doing the same drugs. But what they forget is that the drug landscape of the 1960s in terms of psychedelics was fundamentally different from what we see today. And the largest single difference was that nobody had access to psilocybin-containing mushrooms. Unless you were Timothy Leary or somebody that could fly to Mexico and go to Oaxaca and use mushrooms in an indigenous context, you simply did not have access to them because for whatever bizarre reason, nobody realized that they grew in the United States. And even once they did realize that, nobody really knew how to cultivate them. If you look at early books about psychedelics, like the Psychedelic Guide to the Preparation of the Eucharist, they talk about cultivation of psilocybin-containing mushrooms, but they conclude that getting them to fruit was far too difficult. So what you were expected to do was simply grow the mycelium and then extract the psilocybin from the mycelium, because fruiting them, that's something that nobody could ever manage. Terence Mckenna was the first person to translate the laboratory techniques for the cultivation of psilocybin-containing mushrooms into a format that was accessible to the average person. And he did that in 1976 with his book, Psilocybin, Magic Mushroom Grower's Guide. This had a huge effect on the culture, and it is the reason that psilocybin-containing mushrooms are not only not an obscure substance, they are the first substance that most people use when they try a psychedelic. They have become the most accessible psychedelic. And in the 1960s, that was certainly not the case. You had LSD, you had synthetic DMT, right? Not DMT extracted from Mimosa hostilis, because that didn't exist then. You had a small number of synthetic psychedelics like DET, MDA, and DOM, but that was it. Peyote existed, but it wasn't that widely available. Some people had access to it, but for the most part, it was LSD, and then maybe a little bit of access to things like MDA, DET, DMT, and so on and so forth. I met Terence Mckenna once years ago. We were speaking at a psychedelic conference together, and we were staying in the same house. And I was preparing for my talk with Jason, and I really wanted to talk with Terence Mckenna, but we had all this work to do. And then somebody said, well, we're dabbing. Have you heard of dabbing? And I had heard of dabbing, but I had never dabbed. And Terence Mckenna was dabbing. And I thought, okay, well, I can't pass up this opportunity to dab with Terence Mckenna. So I did maybe a micro dab, a tenth of a dab with Terence Mckenna, and then just went back to work. But I had so many things that I wanted to ask him, and I'm glad that I had the opportunity to talk about a small number of those things in this conversation. As soon as we finished speaking, I started thinking, oh, but what about, I wanted to ask him about his relationship with Gordon Todd Skinner, or I wanted to ask him where he got the DET that he tried, or I wanted to go into more depth about Shaman Pharmaceuticals, which is a company that I keep encountering in all of my conversations with people, and I find more and more interesting with each passing week. Or, the details of his involvement with this clandestine MDMA manufacturing operation, or the ridiculousness of the Terence Mckenna CIA conspiracy theories. Maybe it's better that I didn't go into that, because it is actually ridiculous, but I kind of wanted to hear what he thought about the whole thing. But yeah, we didn't get to talk about everything, but we talked about a lot, and I'm going to link a lot of the papers that we discussed in this conversation, and you should really check them out, because I'm not just flattering him when I say how great his scientific research was. His dissertation, the papers that he co-authored with Shulgin and Repke, these are seminal psychedelic papers that are absolutely crucial to read if you want to understand some of the fundamental research that went into our current understanding of the structure-activity relationship of psychedelics. So enjoy those papers and enjoy this conversation. I'm going to pause momentarily for an ad. This podcast was brought to you by matcha.com, a source of high-quality, heavy metal-tested matcha from Japan. They also now make a freeze-dried matcha cube that they are calling Space Matcha that is very delicious. It dissolves instantly in water, and you can even pop it directly into your mouth. It's a very futuristic product. I carry a bag of them in my backpack, and it's a really good way to have matcha on the go. If you visit matcha.com and use the code Hamilton, you get 20% off any teas that you buy and a free gift. Thank you, matcha.com. Okay. All right.
Yeah. As you
you.
might be able to tell, I'm sun averse. The sun is shining in the basement window here, and I have this piece of cardboard I keep moving. But, you know, I look I look deathly pale in this light. Unfortunately, I'm as pale as a mushroom, which is appropriate for somebody that's basically been living in their basement for 3 years. It's kind of nice to be past COVID, but we'll see if we really are. Anyway, thank you very much for inviting me. I've looked forward to this for a long time.
Oh, good. Yeah. Where are you right now?
I am in my basement in my townhouse in Abbotsford, British Columbia.
There's so much to talk about. I really
Absolutely.
felt a strong connection to your work because it was actually a paper that you wrote was the first scientific article that I ever read. It was not only my introduction to scientific literature on psychedelics, but my introduction to reading scientific papers at all.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. And for me, it was really kind of a very memorable moment because had read about MMDA2, and I started wondering, well, has anyone studied this? Is it dangerous? Does it have neurotoxicity? What are the effects? And your paper was pretty much the only thing that had been published on the pharmacology of MMDA2. So yeah, that was an amazing moment. And you've made so many great contributions again and again. I keep coming across these things that you've done that I don't think tend to get a lot of attention, but for people that are really interested in the science of psychedelics, they're some of the best things that have ever been published on the subject.
Well, that's really kind of you to say. Yes, I do tend to go for the obscure, And I remember the paper because it was when I was doing a postdoc at Stanford, and actually it was I think Alex Shulgin was a co-author on this.
He was.
And he had a bunch of these MMDA, MDMA analogs, and we had an assay in the lab for neurotoxicity, and this was back when people were worried about neurotoxicity of MDMA potentially, and so we basically did a structure activity kind of survey of neurotoxicity in rat models, and looked at the different, and most of them were not neurotoxic. And yeah, I remember that paper because I think it was behavioral pharmacology. That was my sort of brief, sojourn into the world of phenethylamines. I've always been a tryptamine guy and focused on DMT and beta carbolines, but that was when I was doing my postdoc with Steve Peruka at Stanford. He was doing MDMA research because he was interested in it. Also, that's where the funding was, so that's what we did. Yeah, I remember that paper well. Actually, I don't remember it well, but I remember it stood out because it was one of the few that we did with phenethylamines. Yeah,
right. And I think it's interesting because throughout history, there have been these different justifications for scientifically studying psychedelics. And now, if you were to do a paper like that, in the introductory section, you'd say these substances are potential treatments for substance abuse disorder or depression or PTSD or something like that. But at that time, toxicity was one of the major motivations for studying these drugs. And was that something that you were studying because you were genuinely concerned and curious about the toxicity, or was it just a way to be able to study these things?
Yeah, I wasn't really concerned about the toxicity. It was what I studied because that's what was being studied in the lab, and Steve had funding for this, and a lot of people did. And so when I joined his lab, right after I did his lab was the second of seemingly an infinite series of postdocs. Actually, I only did about 3, but that was right after I finished my work at NIMH. I had a so-called Pratt Fellowship at NIMH, and I was using another phenethylamine, DOI, iodinated DOI, and autoradiography to map the serotonin 2A receptors. DOI is incredibly selective for the 2A receptors. So we were doing these maps, all of this in rats' brains, of course. And that's what I did at NIH. And then I got a postdoc with Steve Peruka, and he had funding for MDMA. So, and a bit of DOI. We did DOI research too, because we had these iodine 125 labeled enantiomers of DOI. So we had, again, thanks to Shulgin, he was working in the Lawrence lab at that time, in the radionuclide lab, and so he was able to provide these labeled enantiomers, which gave us a tool that not a lot of neuroscientists had, So I was doing that, then I moved to Steve's lab, and we did the MDMA work, and we did receptor binding with DOI, trying to define a second subtype, a 5H2A subtype, that these things selectively labeled. And in fact, it was, looking back on it, it was bogus science. I mean, I have to say, honestly, because Steve was obsessed with finding another subtype of 5-HT2 that was actually the hallucinogen receptor, the psychedelic receptor. And what was really going on, I mean, we don't have to get into the weeds on this, neuropharmacology stuff, which I barely remember anyway, but we don't have, but what was going on is the DOI binds to a high affinity binding site on the 2A receptor. So you have to have the right conformation of the receptor to get binding. And if you abolish that conformation, then you get very little binding, So, but he was trying to make the argument that no, this is really a separate subtype of serotonin receptor, and he wanted to be the one. And I, frankly, didn't know enough to contradict him to raise questions. So anyway, we did that work. And then I that was the last postdoc I did in my sort of checkered career of postdocs, and then I got back into ethnopharmacology, which was really what I was interested in anyway. I got back to natural products, and at a certain point, Steve said, I'm leaving Stanford. They didn't give him tenure. So he said, I'm going to go work for Genentech, and there's a whole story behind that. I won't get into that. But he said, I'm leaving, and you better go find a job. So that was a wake-up call. And the universe smiled, and at the time, I got an email from Steve King, who was an ethnobotanist that I knew from conferences and things like that. And he sent an email saying there's this new pharmaceutical company starting up in the Bay Area, Shaman Pharmaceuticals. And they have a CNS program. They're mostly looking for antivirals, but they have a CNS program. And you're well suited to this, so you should talk to these people. And I did, and I ended up getting that job. That was my first foray into the corporate world. Because I came to it with all of this receptor binding stuff under my belt. I'd been doing receptor binding for 3 years, 4 years really, if you include NIMH. So I set up their receptor lab, and I worked with Shaman Pharmaceuticals for about 2.5 years. And then I got disillusioned with that, and that was sort of the beginning of my corporate general disillusionment with corporate science. The science they were doing was okay, but this interview is probably going to get me in a lot of trouble. I don't know. Their commitment to reciprocity and giving back, and their commitment to respecting indigenous knowledge and all that was, shall we say, pro forma at best. And that bothered
But even
me.
then, that's more than anyone had ever done, right?
True, yeah. And to their credit, they did set up a nonprofit called the Healing Forest Foundation, and they were supporting indigenous work in Peru. They were actually, the main focus of their drug discovery program was not anything to do with psychoactives. It was looking for antivirals, and they had identified a potential antiviral in sangre de grado, which you may know. It's a famous Amazonian medicine used for wound healing. The sap, the latex of sangre de grado is a very effective anti-inflammatory, heals wounds very quickly, and they thought there was an antiviral in there. So that's really what their focus was. But in order to do that work, they had to harvest a lot of this stuff. A small tree, fortunately it was fast growing. So they did have projects in the Peruvian Amazon to do reforestation, to plant sangre de grado, in degraded lands because it grew easily and so on. So that was what they were mainly focused on. And the CNS program, they were looking for analgesics, basically, and so I set up the receptor lab, and that's what we were using to screen these different extracts. And at the time, there was not very much known about Salvia divinorum. It was known that it had this traditional use and all that. Very little was known about the chemistry. But I was testing extracts of this thing. I had all the opiate receptors set up. That was part of the bank of receptors I had available. I kept testing this thing, and it kept giving these really anomalous results. And I was like, this can't be true. It cannot be that potent. That just doesn't happen. And so I kept running the assays and trying to figure out what I've done wrong to get these results. Then later, Brian Roth came along and characterized it, and yep, that's what it was. I mean, salvinorin A is absolutely, really the most potent natural product ever discovered, including LSD. And I was getting like picomolar, inhibition constants, and it was crazy. And
so you discovered this before Roth? You discovered the kappa agonist activity before Roth and just didn't believe it?
I didn't believe it. Yeah. And it was on crude extracts, and I kept running it, and I thought, this is really, there's something wrong, So I was not a discerning enough scientist, I guess, to say, really, maybe we're onto something here, So I didn't even report it to corporate upstairs. I just said, when we gave the reports, I just went, well, I don't know, these are the results. I don't believe them.
What did you think was happening? Why did you think?
I just couldn't believe that it was that potent at the concentrations that we were using, in these radioligand binding studies. So, but in fact, that was solid data, and that was what was happening. So yeah, a couple of that was another one of my misadventures in science, I suppose. But
that's a really interesting lesson, because that was also before Siebert had done the self-experiment with salvinorin A, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that maybe helped Brian Roth a little bit, because he already knew that the compound in question was amazingly potent and active at sub-milligram doses. So maybe that would have made him more inclined to believe the ultra-high affinity for the kappa opioid receptor.
Well, he worked it all out, and he showed that, it was not only extremely high affinity, but also one of the most selective natural products. It hit the kappa opiate receptor and nothing else. That's just unheard of in a drug, that it's that selective. And, most drugs are dirty drugs, like LSD is a good example. It hits serotonin receptors, of course, but an array of serotonin receptors and dopamine receptors and this and that, all at various affinities. But kappa, the salvinorin A, hits only the kappa receptor. And Brian Roth told me, he said, if I had set out to design a molecule that was a selective kappa opiate receptor agonist, it would not look like salvinorin A. He says, this stuff looks like cholesterol. It has no nitrogen. It's, this terpene thing. But it turns out that was what it was. And kappa, salvinorin A is one of these that may have some utility. It's not clear if it has a therapeutic utility, and not found yet, but you never know. And I always looked at that as sort of the triumph of ethnopharmacology over drug design, and my bias is toward ethnopharmacology. So that was interesting. And then I worked with shaman, for several years on that, and then eventually left them and went to work for Aveda, of all people, the cosmetics company in Minnesota. I met the founder of Aveda at a conference, Seeds of Change, and he said, and I was feeling kind of marginalized at shaman, and not happy with their ethical stance, and he said, well, come work for me, I'll pay you twice as much and you can do whatever you want. And so I said, that's hard to pass up. And so I did move out there. He did pay me twice as much, which wasn't much even at the time. But I couldn't do whatever I wanted, as it turned out. And what I did for them is they were, into natural cosmetics, and this was at the time when the herbal medicines were becoming popular, and they just passed Shea and all this. So Aveda was thinking about bringing out a line of herbal dietary supplements, and they sent me to Brazil to look for cosmetic ingredients. And I went down to Brazil on their ticket, unbeknownst to them. I had been plotting to do this biomedical study with the UDV. And so this was like 1993. So this was a plot, more or less, or I didn't share with them. But I just sort of took leave from what I was supposed to be doing for 5 weeks and went to Manaus and worked on doing this biomedical study with the UDV, which was probably significant at the time. It was one of the first real human. It wasn't exactly a controlled clinical trial. It was really an observational trial. But we got about 8 peer-reviewed papers out of that, and some very interesting results. And the principal investigator on that project, because I wasn't an MD, and I figured would need an MD, and so Charlie Grobe at UCLA, he was in the Hefter Institute, so I knew him. He came down, and he was the principal investigator on what came to be known as the Ayahuasca study. So that was my return to ethnopharmacology, and that played out over the next decade. There were a bunch of papers that emerged out of that study that kind of pointed the way to the scientific investigation of ayahuasca. In fact, in my talks on this, I have a slide that shows how many publications are there about ayahuasca in PubMed prior to 1993, and there's like less than a dozen. After 1993, it just exploded. So a lot of people, now there are like 300 publications if you search on PubMed on ayahuasca, a lot of things pop up. And yet, it's never really made it into, the drug development pipeline, which is probably a good thing. I don't know. I have mixed feelings about it.
Yeah, well, it's not the sort of thing that a scientist is usually drawn to because it has all of these variables associated with it. It's a mixture of different plants. It's hard
Right.
to compare it across studies because there could be dramatically different concentrations of beta-carbolines or DMT or whatever else could be part of the admixture. So it makes sense that prior to your work, the majority of it had been anthropologists and ethnobotanists and people like that were studying it but weren't looking at biochemical effects. Could you tell me a little bit about the findings from that work that you did?
Well, of course, I did my PhD on ayahuasca, in previously. My PhD, which I did actually here in Canada at UBC, was more straight ethnopharmacology, collecting the plants, looking at the constituents, doing in vitro assays for MAO inhibition and that kind of thing. Kind of straightforward stuff, not really, not groundbreaking or anything like that, but solid enough for what it was at the time. But then in the UDV study, we had psychological profiling, and we had, we did pharmacokinetics, we did a number of things like that. And, so we had an interesting finding that came up, which was almost accidental. We very naively asked the question, is there any kind of biochemical marker? Is there anything that makes regular drinkers of ayahuasca different biochemically from non-drinkers in a way that we can detect? And a very naive question. We didn't really know what we were looking for. But as it turned out, when we did this bunch of receptor assays using platelets, couldn't sample these people's brains, but we got platelets. And platelets, as you probably know, can be a peripheral, marker for what's going on in the central nervous system. So we did assays on platelets, and it turns out we found this significantly elevated levels of the serotonin transporters, which compared to age-matched control subjects who were not drinkers. So elevated levels of serotonin transporters. What does that mean? We had no idea, but it was definitely real effect. And so then we thought, well, there is a biochemical difference. Is there any clinical, connection here? Looking into the literature in a pretty cursory way, it became clear that yes, there was a literature associated with anomalously low levels or deficiencies in the serotonin transporters and other monoamine transporters, linked to alcoholism, certain kinds of depression, homicidal tendencies, suicidal tendencies, all these pathologies linked to anomalously low levels of these transporters. Well, that was very interesting, and it was
it's almost paradoxical. Yeah, it's not what you would expect.
Because these were elevated levels, right? And so when we compared that with the behavior, we did these structured psychiatric interviews and with all the subjects and different types of instruments to measure things like cognitive function and memory and all those standard kinds of things. But mostly the structured psychiatric life story interviews of these people was like, tell us your story. How did you start to take ayahuasca? Why did you take it? They almost all came back with these stories that, I came to the UDV, usually a friend invited them, that UDV is not a church that solicits members. You have to kind of find your way in. But they came to the UDV at a time of crisis in my life. I was depressed, or I was, involved in, drug abuse and all sorts of sort of dysfunctionalities, mostly alcoholism. This was the problem. And they all pretty much reported that when they started drinking the tea, it turned their lives around. And they left behind these behaviors, and they felt that as long as they kept drinking regularly, and as long as they stayed in the UDV, they attributed the life change to the context as much as the medicine. But they said, yes, the tea is important, but the church is important, as any good church member would, right? That it was the context of this very supportive community. I used to kid my friends in the UDV. I would say, you guys are like Mormons. But I know now, don't push any buttons. Well, there was something that came up. Anyway, very sorry about that. It looks like this works, though. And we were talking about the UDV study.
Yeah, so I had a question about that. So you found
Sure.
that among UDV ayahuasca drinkers, there was upregulation of serotonin transporters. And that's a little bit paradoxical because, for example, chronic administration of a dopamine reuptake inhibitor like Ritalin would cause upregulation of the dopamine transporter in response to chronic blockade. But with SSRI antidepressants, you see the opposite. You see downregulation. I've never really understood why that happens. And then on top of that, you're seeing the opposite once again. So if you chronically administer Prozac or something like that, you have downregulation of the serotonin transporter. So you're seeing the opposite of what you'd see with an SSRI antidepressant. So how do you interpret what that means?
It's a head scratcher, frankly. I do not know how to interpret that. It's because it's exactly true what you say. And ayahuasca is unique pharmacology because it's got, the main beta-carbolines are harmine and tetrahydroharmine. And tetrahydroharmine, it turns out, is responsible for this effect. And tetrahydroharmine is both an SSRI and an MAO inhibitor. It's a weak MAO inhibitor, but it's a fairly potent SSRI. And something about this combined effect leads to this and this upregulation. It hasn't really been explained. It hasn't even been studied. But the reason we know that it's tetrahydroharmine that's doing this is that one of the investigators on the project, Jace Calloway, who did the work finding this anomaly, this anomalous binding, he actually was working in a lab in Finland at the time, and he went back to his lab and he had pure tetrahydroharmine. He had access to SPECT imaging technology. So he just administered it to himself for a while, over a couple weeks, and he could actually track the upregulation of the receptors in himself, and then when he discontinued it, then they slowly returned to baseline. So we have an N of 1, right? Hardly a controlled experiment, but we have an N of 1, pretty satisfied it's tetrahydroharmine, and I think that's a compound that needs to be looked into in more detail because of this. And if the upregulation is traceable to this behavioral change, that's the thing. The relationship was almost too neat, They have all these pathologies associated with deficits in the transporters, and then they take ayahuasca and it turns their lives around, and you see a corresponding change in the biochemical marker. I mean, it's like, it's almost like you can't believe how clear it is, but that would be something to look at if we ever did a clinical study. And you wouldn't even have to use ayahuasca. You could use tetrahydroharmine and see what happens. But, this work is not, it's not particularly funding, and we weren't able to pursue it at the time. This was a long time ago. Now we might be able to. There are some new companies and so on. Some of them are interested in beta-carbolines, so maybe some of this work will get done.
The beta-carbolines are totally fascinating. I had a I don't want to say traumatic experience, but I had a difficult experience early on making my own ayahuasca, where I thought, oh, okay, everybody combines the two in a single brew. Well, that doesn't make any sense. You want to make two separate brews, one with the enzyme inhibitor, one with the DMT. I'll take the ayahuasca Banisteriopsis caapi brew and then wait 30 minutes or an hour and then take the DMT brew, which, makes some biochemical sense. But the problem was I dramatically overdosed on the ayahuasca brew, and I had this experience of a very, very high dose of the beta carbolines, and it was extraordinarily unpleasant. I mean, extremely nauseating, very sedating. It was psychedelic or visionary, but not in a desirable way, in a kind of vaguely threatening, delirious way. And so after that experience, I maybe unfairly started to dismiss their contribution. And whenever I would make ayahuasca again, I would use meclobamide, this pharmaceutical MAOI, because of the opposite effect, because it didn't exert any character of its own and it sort of transparently activated the DMT. But I think that your work with the beta carbolines is totally fascinating. I was actually revisiting your dissertation recently because I had recommended this process for synthesizing 5-MeO-DMT, which is very easy for even an amateur chemist to do, but there's one catch, which is if you don't keep it sufficiently cold, there's a competing Pictet-Spengler reaction that produces a tetrahydrobeta-carboline. And I think some people may have repeated the process that I had described, and I started seeing reports of 6-methoxy-2-methyl tetrahydrobeta-carboline. And I was wondering, is this an MAOI? Has anyone ever studied this? And the answer is yes, one person studied it, and that was you. And in your dissertation, it's pretty much the only scientific discussion of that particular compound, and you found that it's a very, very weak MAOI, which was comforting because I was afraid that if a side product of this synthesis was producing a potent MAOI, that could be very dangerous in combination with 5-MeO-DMT.
Yes, absolutely. That's right. Combining MAOIs with 5-MeO-DMT is probably not a good idea, because obviously of the serotonin syndrome, because there was actually there was a report a few years ago of somebody that had died taking supposedly ayahuasca, and they had the toxicology showed they had extremely high levels of 5-methoxy-DMT in their system. And a number of us ayahuasca scientists wrote into the Journal of Toxicology and said, this is not what to expect. 5-MeO-DMT does not occur in ayahuasca in any traditional preparation, and there was something going on there that this guy had either deliberately added a bunch. I speculated even maybe that it was a suicide, but I didn't really put that in the letter. But the blood levels of the 5-MeO were off the charts, so something was going on, and he was taking an MAO inhibitor, and he didn't make it. So these things are not without their dangers when you combine these things. But there's lots of work to be done on these beta carbolines. There's no doubt.
And given that enzyme inhibition in and of itself doesn't produce these sorts of visionary effects, what is it that things like Harmine and Harmaline are doing to produce this sort of visionary effect? Because I don't believe they have very high 2A affinity.
They don't have high 2A affinity, but they do have some, and that's a good question. They have not been studied well enough to really know what they do. They have psychoactive effects, and they're sedative, as you say. At high doses, they can be very nauseating. I mean, they're not pleasant drugs to take, by themselves, and that's just another area that really ought to be looked at. There's a lot of work, as you know, in this area. The whole pharmacology of ayahuasca. I mean, there's tons and tons of PhDs left to be done with ayahuasca. By no means has it been figured out. Like all the admixture plants, and this admixture technology, besides the DMT and Banisteriopsis combination, there's a whole pharmacopoeia of admixture plants that are occasionally used, and sometimes mixed with ayahuasca, sometimes used in the dietas, but they're used, in conjunction with ayahuasca, and they modulate the effects. And there's just nobody's figured out exactly. A lot of these are highly alkaloidal plants, indole alkaloids, but not tryptamines, not simple, like iboga type alkaloids, for example, in things like Tabernet Montagna, which is a very commonly used admixture plant. What does that do to the effects of ayahuasca? So, would that there were funding, this work could be done. And somebody else will have to do it, because my day is done. And the other thing is, another factor here is, the plants are disappearing and the knowledge is disappearing, and there's a lot of pressure on these plants now because ayahuasca has become so popular, and over harvesting and so on. These are effectively endangered species, and that's something I wanted to talk with you about. In this podcast, we kind of got off on this tangent, but I did want to take a minute to talk about this conference that we're organizing in the UK. You probably heard of the ESPD 50.
Of course, yes.
That I did in 2017. Well, we're doing ESPD 55 in May. And same model. It's going to be in the UK at an amazing place, and we've got an incredible list of speakers, and we're going to do this. So I wanted, with your help, to let your listeners know about this. The website is under construction, but it should be live next week, maybe as early as Monday. And it will be just espd55.com. So people can look at it and see if they're interested in it. Like we did the last time, we're going to live stream it. And last time we did this, this was pre-COVID, right? And we live streamed, and we had 75,000 people who watched this thing at one point or another. So we hope to double that this time. And we're charging a little bit because I now have this nonprofit, but not very much for access. And the recordings will be up. And, take a look at it. I can let you know when the website's up. We're hoping to launch it on Monday.
Oh, wow.
So that's our biggest project with the McKenna Academy. When I did the one in 2017, I had no institution. I was just a freelance, investigator, sort of, with no real respectable, institutional affiliation other than the University of Minnesota. I was still teaching there. Well, I left that behind, and then I came up to Canada, and then I said, well, I'm basically an academic at heart. Nobody wants to give me a position, so I'll make my own damn academy and teach from that, and that's what I did. And we've been, I have an amazing team. We've been pretty successful with fundraising, so we're doing this conference. And then we have another big project going on, a long-term project called Biognosis at McKenna Academy. And people can look at that. And this is a very complex long-term project. Initially, it has to do with making a series of documentaries about Amazonian traditional medicine and kind of a snapshot of the state of the art at this time in the post-COVID, post-ayahuasca tourism globalization, climate change environment. Traditional medicine in the Amazon is still very important to the people, and this knowledge is in danger of being lost. And so what the subtitle of that, or the subtext, is Bridges to Ancestral Wisdom. We're trying to collect this knowledge and preserve it and make these documentaries. We're going to release the first one in the series at ESPD 55. And then the second phase of it, which may or may not ever happen because it takes a lot more funding, but I think we'll be able to get it, is to work with the herbarium in Iquitos. And my association with the herbarium at the University in Iquitos goes back 40 years or more. When I first went to Iquitos to do my field work, I hooked up with people at the university there. And one of the botanists, who is now the curator of the herbarium, a guy named Juan Ruiz, he was a forestry student at the time. And the director of the herbarium at the time, just told him, basically take these gringos out, let them collect some plants, bring them back alive. I'm sure that was the conversation that was held. But over the years, I became great friends with Juan Ruiz, and he has incredible knowledge. Just it's all in his head, He never writes anything down. So he has this amazing experience as, he's got 1 foot in science, being a botanist, and 1 foot in traditional medicine, since he's lived in Iquitos all his life. And we want to do this project to digitize the herbarium in Iquitos and put it online, but not just a bunch of plant images. We want to actually make an immersive representation of it. So we're calling it like the visionary rainforest. We're working with some artificial intelligence and VR wizards who have very interesting ideas on how to make this a dynamic, interactive, immersive experience to actually go into the collections in the herbarium and fly through them. And all of in the representation of the of the rainforest, the region around Iquitos where these things are collected, there'll be like geolocation nodes where these collections were made. And then you can click a node and the collection will come up, who collected it, where, when, and sometimes why. And then that will be linked to other databases, like phytochemical and ethnobotanical databases and so on, to make this a really, the idea is to kind of take this, sort of third world, rundown, moldering, neglected herbarium and turn it into a world-class resource for floristic research in the Amazon. So, it's our little bit to try and slow down what's happening there. Because, I've always thought that if you can link a plant to information, you've increased the value of the plant, essentially. And, you make somebody, and the fact that somebody collected a plant and deposited it in the herbarium means that at some point, for some reason, they thought that was worthwhile. So that'll be a 3 to 5 year project and probably cost well into the millions if we do it right. And, we don't know if we can get support, but, we're optimistic. There's a lot of interest right now in preserving this knowledge. So those are our 2 big things that we're doing through the McKenna Academy right now. So that's my pitch. That's my plug.
That sounds amazing. Sounds really great. I
think it will be. Just this is our website. It's just mckenna.academy, and people can look at other stuff. There's a lot of resources and links and things like that.
That's great. Yeah, I'll link to that in the description of this. I was reading a profile of Mark Plotkin that was published in the New York Times in 1999, and there was an interview with Wade Davis where he made a comment saying something along the lines of that the low-hanging fruit had already been picked, that the reason that Shaman Pharmaceuticals was encountering difficulty finding viable commercial products was because people had already found all of the obvious candidates decades ago. And on one hand, you have this fact that we live in a world of almost infinite biodiversity and we've only scratched the surface. But on the other hand, what Wade Davis said seems to be more or less true. I'm not aware of any major ethnobotanical breakthroughs that have occurred in recent years. Are you aware of any new psychedelic plants that have been discovered or any major new discoveries in that realm?
Well, yes and no. I mean, yes, there are. I don't agree. The low-hanging fruit has been collected pretty much, but that's why you have to look at the more obscure areas. And at ESPD 50, at ESPD 55, at ESPD 50 we talked about this, but ESPD 55 as well will talk about that. You have to look into the, not even necessarily, at the plant world. I mean, the fungal world. For example, fungal endophytes, which are fungi that live inside of plants, but often the phytochemical constituents that you find in plants, like sedges, for example, are not from the plant. They're actually from the fungi that live inside of them. And for example, in Peru, there's a group of sedges.
This podcast is also brought to you by the Apollo. The Apollo is a wearable, vibrating bracelet or anklet that appears to be able to modulate your consciousness. And when I first heard about this thing, I was very skeptical. I was at a conference and met a psychiatrist and neuroscientist named David Rabin, and he had built this prototype and let me wear it for a night. During the entire night, I felt very calm and euphoric and good. And I thought, okay, well, maybe this is just placebo. But I also told him that if he ever built more of them, I'd really like to try it again. So he sent me one, and now I've used it for hundreds of hours. It's a very versatile, wearable device that they are selling for stress relief, but you can modulate the frequency of the vibrations to create either a stimulating or calming effect. You can actually sleep wearing it and it seems to help sleep, or you can change the frequency and it has a sort of stimulating effect, which I sometimes use while I'm on a long drive. I've tried a lot of these different non-pharmacological means for alteration of consciousness, like binaural beats and various types of stroboscopic visual stimulation. Usually I'm skeptical of this sort of thing, but this tactile modulation of mood actually does seem to work. The idea being that it delivers a gentle, soothing vibration that conditions your nervous system to recover and rebalance after stress. That's the idea. It's sort of like a vibrating chair or strapping a purring kitten to your leg. If you find a purring kitten calming, then I think you would also find this calming. It's a similar sort of phenomenon. If you're interested in getting one of these devices, you can go to apolloneuro.com to read more about it and use the promo code Hamilton for 10% off. Thank you, Apollo. So back to, you were talking about novel ergoline compounds. Have the psychoactivity of any of these compounds been assessed?
Haven't really been assessed. I mean, a lot of the ergolines in the piri-piris, in the fungi associated with them, are not that different from what you find in morning glory seeds. So morning glories are the low molecular weight lysergic acid amides. I imagine these are similar, but thing is, the chemistry is really complex, so there may be some interesting things there. And there are new psychedelics out there. Like some of these admixture plants are, they're admixtures used in the dietas with ayahuasca, but some of them are purportedly, psychoactive or psychedelic, maybe psychedelic or certainly psychoactive in and of themselves, And so that's a whole Amazonian pharmacopoeia that's worth sorting out. And there are other, there are other interesting. I mean, for example, as long as we're on that subject, there's one called it's called Toei, Toei negro, in traditional Amazonian medicine, Toei is datura, right, or Brugmansia, the tree daturas, and we know they're psychoactive. They're scopolamine. Toei negro is a different family, Acanthaceae. It's a Teleostachia lanceolata. It's said that if you make a tea out of the leaves, that you have a 3-day experience, in which the plant appears to you and talks to you and this kind of thing. And, and it sounds very much like, it sounds anticholinergic to me, and I think there are, that's a whole area of pharmacology that is difficult to explore because, the states of mind are not very pleasant. So it takes somebody braver than me to go after this. But, I've done my thing with Datura, and I'm done with that. I took Datura at the age of 16, not even knowing what it was. And, it was a wild ride for sure, which I wrote about in my book. And, yeah. You probably dipped into that area too, right?
Just a tiny bit. I've taken trihexafenadil because I wanted to experience it with something that had a shorter half-life than atropine or scopolamine. And what I felt, which was really marginal, was already enough for me to think that I didn't want to go further. I'm sure one day I'll have a full anticholinergic delirium experience, but I'm not in a rush to do it.
I don't blame you. It was very difficult, and I was so ignorant of what I was doing. Here's how ignorant I was, Hamilton. At age 16, I thought that I was taking a variety of morning glories. I knew nothing about plants. And this bush was growing in some vacant lot close to my house, and I thought, oh, this is moonflower. So I thought it was a kind of morning. I shouldn't even be admitting this on public, but I thought, oh, this will be, it'll be like LSD. And I had taken LSD once before in my life. So I took this stuff and, had a typical Datura experience, which was harrowing and horrific, and all the time laboring under the delusion that, oh, this is what a bad LSD trip is all about. No, this is what a textbook Datura trip is about. And it was crazy. I mean, it was 36 hours, and it was really very strange. And I did not want to repeat it, and so I didn't. But the thing is, there's probably things about these states of mind that might have some virtue. I don't know. I mean, it's very peculiar. And interestingly, looking at some of these novel, potentially psychoactive plants and fungi that we'll be talking about at the conference, one of them is these putatively psychoactive boletes that have come up, used in New Guinea and now used in, there are reports from China that's, I think they're called Xiao Ren Ren, which in Chinese means the little person. And you see these diminutive Lilliputian-like figures, and one of our presenters is going to be talking about these species, these Boletus species. And if you read the reports, it sounds very much like an anticholinergic nightshade type Datura-like experience, which they last, hours to days, many hours to days, sometimes long periods. Like there are reports of people don't recover after a month, and if you look at the phenomenology of it, sounds very nightshady, sounds anticholinergic, But, again, there may be novel chemistry here. And that's one of the reasons it's important, to look for novel psychoactive drugs. The whole premise of ESPD 50 or ESPD is not just to find new novel ways to get high, although there is that, but to find new molecules like salvinorin A, which is not something most people would take recreationally, but it's opened up a whole new area of psychopharmacology. Novel structures often lead to novel mechanisms, and you can really learn something using this. So these things are molecular probes as much to, useful in neuroscience as they are to provide, reckless psychonauts like you and me with novel experiences. There's really a scientific rationale beyond that. So yeah.
Has anyone done chemical analysis on these boletes?
Not that I know of. And they're very hard to nail down. Sometimes they're active and sometimes they're not. And it seems to depend on whether they're cooked or not, or how much they're cooked. I had some friends. Still have some friends. Actually, at ESPD 50, they were at the conference, and that's just when these reports were surfacing, and we were talking about it. And the gentleman, his husband is Chinese and speaks Chinese fluently, and they thought, well, and they lived in Thailand at the time, and they thought this is worth going after. So they went to Yunnan province where these boletus grow during the mushroom seasons. They went through the marketplace. They ate every damn boletus they could find, and they got absolutely no effect. So that's kind of interesting. And then because my friend was convinced, this will be a new molecule, we'll make billions, and I said, hold on, cowboy, wait a minute. You got to find at least an active mushroom. They couldn't find one, but plenty of other people have. So what determines, whether they are active or not? It could be seasonal. It could be a different species. It's just a mystery, which is why it's worth looking into. But nobody's figured this out yet.
Have you followed this issue with Rotocollibia Immaculata, this mushroom that contains a kappa agonist? But it seems that the most recent research shows that it's not actually a kappa agonist.
I am not familiar with that.
Yeah. Colibolide. It seemed like there was a salvia-like mushroom for a period, but now that finding has been revised or disproven.
Who did this work?
The original pharmacology and characterization of colibolide was maybe in 2017, and I can't remember who did the work, but the new work where they studied colibolide again and found that it didn't bind to kappa came out this year. So I was excited because I thought this was an example of something totally new that had been found, not only a new potentially psychedelic mushroom, but a new type of psychedelic experience from a mushroom. But yeah, it doesn't look good anymore.
It doesn't look like a psychedelic?
It doesn't look like colibolide binds to the kappa opioid receptor and acts as an agonist.
But then that's exciting because you could figure out what it did bind to, and who knows, maybe it's a novel receptor.
But this is the opposite. This is, instead of people observing an effect and then looking for a chemical pharmacological explanation, people found the chemical and the pharmacology before observing any effect. I don't know that this actually has an effect. This is another, I'm not aware of any self-experiments, because this is kind of one of the complexities, is you do need some human interaction with these plants in order to really validate these findings. I mean, the same thing happened with 5-bromo-DMT in sea sponges, where, it was very provocative, and Sasha Shulgin wrote about it in T-Call, and it's easy enough to synthesize. I've synthesized it. It even became a gray market commodity. A lot of people used it, but it's incredibly weak as a psychedelic. It's interesting that it's the only psychedelic known from the ocean, and only the ocean, but even with IV injection, it is not an especially potent compound, but it does do something. It is a very weak psychedelic.
Yeah, we have somebody reporting on that at ESPD 55. We've got a marine biologist that's been that's going to give an interesting talk on these sponges. He's actually done some metabolic studies as well, and feeding precursors into these sponges and getting some novel compounds. I understand that's what his report is going to be about. So that's interesting. As far as this other one, Hamilton, I mean, get on it, man. You're the one now, because I'm much too old to do this stuff, and I still, I have some cardiac issues. I don't want to kill myself. Another area that's interesting that I really tried to get somebody to present on, and they just blew me off, but the psychedelic fish, or the psychoactive fish, and there are about 30 species of them. Again, the chemistry is a complete black box, and like the Solema porgy is the common. That's one of the ones that's surfaced, no pun intended, recently, and I think that's fascinating. And these are another group that sometimes they're psychoactive and sometimes they're not, and pointing to the conclusion that it's not the fish, but probably something that the fish is sequestering,
Yeah.
But that's another really interesting area of obscure psychopharmacology.
Yes, it certainly is. Yeah, there's one passage in your book that I wanted to ask you about. You briefly describe being recruited to synthesize MDMA before it was a controlled substance in the 1980s. And I'm very curious about that time period when people were making MDMA in these semi-underground gray market labs. It wasn't explicitly illegal because there was no federal analog act and it wasn't a controlled substance.
Right.
And there was a emerging demand for it. And you yourself say that even though it wasn't illegal, there was something a little bit off-putting about going right to industrial manufacture of this psychoactive drug. Could you tell me a little bit more about that period and what was going on?
Sure, I can. Yeah, I was fresh out of my PhD. I was down in California trying to find either a job or a postdoc, and not so easy when you've got a PhD in ethnopsychopharmacology, and people are not beating down the door to hire you. And this fellow was someone that I think Alexander Shulgin, was the outside examiner on my thesis. So I had a connection, and then I'd been with him to Esalen and Terence a couple of times. And he introduced me to this gentleman. I don't even remember his name, but they had a place up in Mendocino, I think, and they wanted to manufacture kilograms of MDMA every week, and they had this semi-automatic synthesis system set up, and and he said, you don't even have to know chemistry. All you have to do is turn the machine on and it'll do it, and we just want you to, come on and do it, and as much for who you are as what you know. But at the time I was kind of full of myself, and I said, well, this doesn't look like a career path for me, even though I probably could have made a lot of money, but I decided that I would just pass it up. I went to the place, I met the guy, and it seemed very culty to me, and I have an aversion to cults, and it was like, oh, this is weird. I just don't like the vibe, so I never pursued it.
Why do you think Sasha was involved with these people? Because this is kind of one of the interesting things, is I've heard a number of people who Sasha helped in the industrial, or at the very least large-scale manufacture of MDMA. So this is clearly something that he not only approved of, but even facilitated to some extent. Did he tell you at all about his motivations for even involving you in such an enterprise?
No, not really. I mean, he was just, Sasha helps everybody. He was so open about everything, and he just knew that I just got my PhD. He knew I was looking for a job and looking for some kind of a gig. After coming down from Canada, and he just, it was just, well, these people are doing something interesting. Why don't you give them a call? And I did. He neither endorsed them nor denounced them. He just said, this is one group that's doing this. There might be a lead here. But I ended up not working for, not doing anything with them. And I actually ended up going to San Diego and working for doing another postdoc, which had nothing to do with psychopharmacology. That was actually my only qualification was that I knew sterile technique, and that we were doing this work with these strains of yeast and selenium, and that was a whole other story. But that was not something that I wanted to do or was interested in particularly. But I wanted to. It was a postdoc. It took me to San Diego. I met some very interesting people in San Diego, not connected to my job. But then the NIH fellowship came in. Back in those days, people sent reprints, requests, right? No emails, nothing like that. You got a postcard in the mail. And I got a postcard from this guy at NIMH, and requesting my papers on ayahuasca, which had just come out. And I knew him from the literature because his name was Juan Saavedra. And he and Julius Axelrod had published on the first papers on endogenous DMT. They'd isolated DMT from rabbit's lung, I believe. And I thought that was interesting. And here he is requesting a paper. So I wrote a letter sent the reprint, and basically said, if you're crazy enough to request this paper, maybe you're crazy enough to send, hire me on or give me a gig of some kind. I didn't quite put it that way, but just, we have mutual interest here. And and he wrote back very kind letter and said, well, yeah, as a matter of fact, there is this program called the Pratt Fellowship, the Pharmacology Research Associate Traineeship for non-pharmacologists to get training in pharmacology. And he said, apply for this. I can sponsor you. Maybe you'll get it. Maybe you won't. Well, I did, and I got it. That's what took me to Bethesda. And originally we were going to work on ayahuasca, something about ayahuasca, because as it turned out, as I later learned, he had been in the Amazon with Schultes and my supervisor, Neil Towers, on the not Heraclitus, that was later, the RV Alpha Helix, the Scripps Institution of Oceanography's research vessel, took a ethnobotanical expedition to the Amazon in 1979. And, Schultes was in charge, and Neil Towers, my PhD supervisor, was in charge, and Juan Saavedra was on that boat as well. So he actually knew my supervisor in the Amazon, which I didn't even know when he invited me to apply for the fellowship. I learned that later. And so it's interesting. It's another one of these small world phenomena. There's just not that many of us, and it's a fairly incestuous bunch back in those days anyway.
Yeah. And I also wanted to ask you about your 1976 publication of the Psilocybin Mushroom Grower's Guide, which is something so important that I don't think people even fully recognize the magnitude of that contribution, because today we take mushrooms so much for granted that I think if you ask an average person, did mushrooms exist in the 60s? Were people taking psychedelic mushrooms? They'd think, yeah, of course. People did psychedelics in the 60s, and they don't know that it really wasn't until the mid to late 70s, if not the 80s, and really probably the 90s, that this became a prominent part of psychedelic culture. Mm-hmm. And that can be traced very much directly to you. I think, your brother often gets a lot of the credit, if not all of the credit, but you are the one who is responsible for establishing the technique for that cultivation. So mm-hmm. Did you realize how monumental what you were doing was and what effect it was going to have on the culture?
Not really. I mean, we only later did we realize how impactful that was, and of all the things that contributions I've made to psychedelics in some ways I'm proudest of that one, which we published the book under pseudonyms, right? Because we were paranoid. But in terms of its actual impact, it's had been far more significant than any paper I've published because, it did have this societal impact. And but we didn't really understand that at the time. We just wanted to figure out how to grow mushrooms because we'd come back from La Chirera. We'd had full of these crazy experiences, which you probably have read about. And we wanted validation. We wanted to give people access to mushrooms so that they could validate what we'd been, our experiences, or not, and just say the McKennas are nuts. This doesn't happen. Well, of course, people did validate it and then some. So that was the motivation at the time, was just to figure out a way to grow them ourselves. And then it seemed like it made sense to publish this little book, or really a pamphlet is what it amounted to, but it was a simple way to do it. Of course, there are many better ways to do it these days. It's kind of, obsolete. It's pretty labor intensive, but that's what we did, and we wanted to get it out to people, and that really gave people a lot of access to mushrooms. I mean, any reasonably, persistent, nerdy 11th grader could figure out how to do this, and a lot of them did. And I really think that's what brought mushrooms to the, brought mushrooms into society, gave people access to mushrooms, We weren't the only ones that were working on this at the time. There were other people like Bob Harris and actually even Paul Stamets at the time. But we were the ones that published, and in an accessible way. So yeah, I am glad we did it, and I'm not repentant.
Did you know Stephen Pollock?
I never knew him. No.
Yeah.
Notorious guy.
Yeah, certainly. And you mentioned being afraid when you published that, and I think even today people are sometimes afraid to talk about these things. And if you're somebody who is, a prominent figure in the psychedelic community, often the last thing you want to do is acknowledge that you're afraid to talk about these things, because if you're afraid, then everyone else should be afraid. But it was, I'm sure, a very big part of not only your motivation for not using your real name and something like that, but throughout your career. I mean, was that something that weighed on you and on your brother, the fear that maybe there would be some reprisal for speaking so openly about these things and making such enormous contributions to public understanding of them?
Yeah, I think there was a little of that. I mean, these were very paranoid times, the 70s, the 80s, it was the war on drugs. Terence was really one of the few public voices that was talking about psychedelics in a public way. And yeah, he was concerned, I was concerned, especially because we were in fact growing these mushrooms during a lot of that time, which is something that, there was a commercial aspect to it as well. I mean, my graduate student days were a lot less impoverished than most of my fellow graduate students because I could grow mushrooms in my closet and did, and made many people happy, made a little money on the side, not very much. I mean, I was far from getting rich off these things, but there was a lot of paranoia. And Terence did that too for a long time. But then, particularly as he began to get more public, his paranoia levels also rose, and eventually he decided that he had to stop, and he did. And by that time he was like a cultural icon, so he could make a living using his talent, which is his gift of gab, basically, being Irish, right? he could spin out these tales. I mean, people would listen rapt to anything that he wanted to talk about. And, I used to tell him, you could read the phone book in front of these people and they'd hang on to every word. It wasn't what he said, it was the way he said it.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's like poetry. It really is amazing.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Yeah. And he was also selling spores, which is something that I don't often see talked about. His company was called Syzygy. What was he doing?
That's right. Well, that was a way, exactly. He and Kat started this business called Syzygy, and they were selling spores. And that was a way to get the mushrooms out to people and sell these, the spores, which didn't contain psilocybin, and they were not really illegal. Eventually, states started to outlaw them, make them more difficult. But and when they started that, I thought, no, this will never fly. That's ridiculous. People are not going to pay for spores. But I was completely wrong. They got a lot of orders for these things, and they would sell them on these little slides, microscope cover slips, and in a little plastic. They were very elegantly presented. They sold thousands of those things, and that was part of spreading the spore, I suppose. Probably one of the reasons I wasn't so paranoid, I mean, I was somewhat paranoid, but one of the reasons I was less paranoid was I was able to affiliate myself with respectability, having these academic connections, either, like I could go to NIH and study psychedelics, or I could, work with different people who had permission to do this work. So by hiding behind the academic, the shield of academic respectability, I could get away with a lot, and it was all perfectly legal. I was not particularly interested in not being legal. It was, and then, so that is how I dealt with it, and for a long time, Terence was the person doing the public speaking. I was not particularly interested in being a public figure, but then we began to be known for work that we did together. But I preferred to stay in the background for a long time. It was just easier that way. And he was doing such a great job of it, so I didn't need to be out there. And like this, this UDV study is a good example. I was working for a company, and the study had nothing to do with the company. It was completely unofficial, but because it was in Brazil, nobody was concerned. We did all this work. We published peer-reviewed papers, and then, eventually that. But there was always this sort of patina of respectability and academic, something or other about it.
Right. The cosmetics company doing ayahuasca research. It's good.
Right. And then Charmin Pharmaceuticals, same thing. I took that receptor binding experience and set up their receptor lab. And then, later that in the aughts, in the mid 2000s, that came in handy as well, because I did. I was at the University of Minnesota teaching ethnopharmacology and botanical medicines for the Center for Spirituality and Healing, which is the alternative complementary medicine program. And I was just an adjunct professor. I was nobody. Adjunct professors are scum. They're lower than the janitors on the scale, if anybody who's been one. But I liked teaching that, and I went to a conference by NIDA that was staged by NIDA, and they invited me. The name of the conference was Potential Therapeutic Uses of Illicit Natural Psychoactive Substances, but they got the word illicit in there. They invited me to speak, along with other people. I think Jonathan Ott was there, some other people were there like that, and I talked about ayahuasca, which is what I'd always talked about, and presented and all that, and went home. And then a couple weeks later, I got a letter or an email from somebody at the Stanley Medical Research Institute. That was a foundation that supported schizophrenia research. And he said I was in the audience at this symposium that you presented, thought it was very interesting, and he said, we're interested in new medicines, new compounds. We're interested in natural products to treat schizophrenia. And we have a study going on in China, looking at traditional Chinese medicine, nothing in South America. Would you potentially be interested in applying for a grant? And I said, well, sure, why not? I don't know, I'm just an adjunct professor. And he said, well, we gave away $130 million last year to support this research. And I said, well, where do I sign, right? Anyway, I did apply for the grant, and I didn't get $130 million, but I got $500,000. And that was great for me, because here I am more or less way past my work in Peru, but it was a chance to reconnect with all these people and that I'd worked with before, including Juan Ruiz. So I went to Peru 4 or 5 times to do collections on their nickel, and brought these samples back. And I connected with Brian Roth, and they did all the receptor stuff at that time. They had all of this set up. They ran the NIMH psychoactive drug screening program, which you're probably familiar with. So I connected with him and a chemist at the University of Minnesota, natural products chemist. So I was kind of the glue between these different factions, and we collected a fair amount of plants, and we screened these extracts in about 30 different kinds of neuroreceptor assays. And the idea was to find something. The focus was really to look for plants that might be useful for treating cognitive deficits, not so much schizophrenia per se, but cognitive deficits in people with schizophrenia. So that grades over into dementia and that kind of thing. And we didn't find a novel compound that was the solution, but we found half a dozen plants that were quite interesting in terms of their receptor profiles, and didn't really get beyond that. Didn't get further funding to go into it. But again, this is another lead that could be followed up. And some of these Amazonian plants are contain varieties of mixtures of interesting indole alkaloids, and so that's what these plants were. So that was good, and eventually a paper came out about that. So I was able to fulfill my obligations for the grant and reconnect with Peru, and that's really when I started going back to Peru on a regular basis and reconnecting with ayahuasca and all these people that I'd worked with before. So that was it.
You mentioned your dissatisfaction with shaman pharmaceuticals, and based on my very limited understanding of that company and what they were trying to do, it sounds like they were at least trying to do the right thing, and maybe it didn't pan out exactly how they would have hoped. But now there are hundreds of psychedelic pharmaceutical companies that have emerged in the last couple of years, and I'm sure you're hearing from a lot of them. What do you think generally about what's going on in the psychedelic space?
Well, I think it's a very mixed bag. None of these companies are really looking seriously at natural products, other than psilocybin. And even psilocybin isn't good enough for them, because they want to be able to patent things. And psilocybin's been around forever. And even though psilocybin is probably close to the perfect psychedelic, in some ways it has everything one would want in a psychedelic. Compatibility with human metabolism, very profound effects, non-toxic, all of these things. Terence used to say, psilocybin is made for man. Well, he should have said made for humans, but that was back in the day. But that's true. It's almost the ideal psychedelic in some ways. And now I think these companies that are so anxious to make a derivative or patent a formulation or, it's not really necessary. Maybe something novel will come out of it. But there's this, in the corporate competitive space, there's always the desire to make something proprietary. And many of these companies, most of them, I think, are ignorant of the potential to find new psychedelics in nature. Otherwise, they would be funding some of this research. They're out there. They can be found. Anytime you're dealing with natural products research, there's always the potential for, replicating what you've already found. Just another tryptamine from the Amazon. Well, that's not good enough. It's got to be some new thing from the Amazon or from Africa and so on. But they do exist. But I don't think companies are putting a lot of effort into this. And I think that the corporatization of psychedelics is fraught with pitfalls. For one thing, I think the corporations need to recognize that they have an obligation, that they're using indigenous knowledge. And historically, this has always been the case. Biopiracy has a long history, whether it comes to food plants or medicinal plants or whatever, that, they just take the knowledge, thank you very much, and they make, profitable medicines out of it, and very rarely give anything back to the indigenous people that are, after all, the stewards of this knowledge. So that's another thing the McKenna Academy is, committed to try and help indigenous people have a stake in this. In general, they're open to sharing their knowledge, but it would be nice if there was some kind of a give back. And how you get that is sometimes complicated. It's not enough to just pay them off. They don't even often relate to money, and there's governments, politicians, all that, a lot of potential for corruption there.
So we've talked a lot about undiscovered natural products and the potential that exists in that domain. And you were mentioning how a lot of these pharmaceutical companies are focused on the synthesis of novel compounds as opposed to natural product discovery, and which makes sense to me given how easy it is to generate new psychedelics. I made a new psychedelic last week. It's easy to do. But you've also done quite a few publications on synthetic psychedelic compounds. You co-authored a really amazing publication with David Repke, where you looked at the relative 2A and 1A binding affinities of a variety of different, very unusual tryptamine psychedelics. Could you tell me a little bit about that paper? David Repke did such remarkable work, and his name is almost never mentioned in discussions of psychedelic history. And I also can't help but wonder, was anybody testing these compounds? Were you or Repke doing self-experiments with those compounds in conjunction with the binding work?
Yeah. Well, yes, I wasn't. I didn't have enough to actually test. I got a few milligrams from him and from Shulgin, but Repke was testing them, and Sasha was testing them, and yeah, so there was testing going on. In fact, I think that they reported some of that in one of their papers, and Repke got into big trouble with Syntex where he worked because of that. He didn't do the work at Syntex, but he did report in a paper with Shulgin that they had tested some of them, and he got burned for that, you know. But yeah, that was an interesting series to sort through at the time. That was another Perutka Lab project, and again we were under the working under the impression that there were these two distinct serotonin receptors. You know, it was a misunderstanding of what was actually going on, but still. It was an interesting paper for sure.
How do you say it was why was it a misunderstanding?
Well, like I said before, you know, Steve Peruka was convinced that with the DOI was labeling a subtype. It wasn't labeling a subtype. It was labeling a high affinity conformation of the 5-HT2A receptor, you know, which was already in the literature. We knew this. He didn't want to confirm it, basically, because that would have interfered with his aspirations to be the discoverer of a new serotonin receptor. I mean, I like Steve. I'm still in touch with him, but this is a good example of scientific hubris, you know, that actually, I think, a willful misinterpretation of the data, if you want to know my honest opinion. And we should have not done that. But what did I know? I was just his postdoc, and he was like the god of serotonin. So if he said it was, it must have been so. It's a good example of, you know, there's always a backstory in science, you know, and you can't separate people's personalities. It is a human endeavor, after all. And scientists are, you know, they have their own agendas.
Do you think that the idea that 2A was responsible was somehow insufficient because it seemed like there would have to be something else? Like 2A didn't seem like it was enough of an explanation for psychedelic action? Because this is one of the things that happens when you study psychedelics, is you might at least superficially think there's got to be something really crazy going on, something that is doing something so dramatic to consciousness. It's got to be binding to some special magical part of the brain, or it has to activate some special magical receptor that nothing else touches in any way. And then you find, they're acting in the cerebral cortex, as do many other things, and they're acting at 5-HT2A receptors, as do many other things, maybe not quite in exactly the same way, but from a biochemical pharmacological perspective, there's nothing psychedelic or bizarre about the way psychedelics act.
No, exactly. And they are the 5-HT2A receptors, and I think, you know, like a lot of these things are not that selective, but they do hit those key receptors, you know. I mean, at NIH, when I was there and we were doing autoradiography, we published papers about this, where, you know, we used iodinated LSD to label the receptors, and then we could use cold DOI to displace the receptor sites that they had in common, and then reverse that and show that LSD and DOI bound to the same receptors by doing replacement experiments. And yeah, I think it was more, like you say, wow, there's got to be some kind of magical receptor for psychedelics. I mean, that is magical thinking, and it's not scientific thinking. It's the 5-HT2A receptor. It's magical enough, obviously, you know, and there's lots to be still learned about those receptors. There are 5-HT2A agonists that are not psychedelic, you know, but I don't think they're binding to some. I don't think psychedelics are binding to some undiscovered receptor. I think it depends on where their 5-HT2 receptors, but where they are and so on is probably what makes them different. This is interesting. This is current too now. Number of companies that want to develop new compounds, they want to chemically engineer the molecule to get rid of the psychedelic experience, right? This is regarded as an undesirable side effect, of the and they want to get rid of that. So you have the therapeutic experience, but not the actual psychedelic experience. I think that approach is so full of shit, I can't even begin to tell you. It's just absurd. And it's mostly done by people that have never taken a psychedelic, probably. But I think that's just a very wrong-headed approach.
Well, I just don't think it's going to work. That's my
feeling.
My feeling is go ahead, try, knock yourself out. See, if you make it work, congratulations. I just don't predict it's going to happen.
I don't think it is going to happen either, because I think the therapeutic effect of psychedelics has to do with, basically disabling the default mode network, temporarily. And that's where the therapy happens. It lets you step outside of this reference frame, and look at your problem, addiction, trauma, whatever it might be, from a fresh perspective. And it produces catharsis. In some ways you could say these things are cathartogens. And that reset, and it really is like a reset of your computer. You blow it up. You blow up the default mode network, and of course the brain, like all biological systems, it tends toward equilibrium. So it will fall back together, but it's more functional now. It's literally, I think it's really similar to resetting your computer. Gets the glitches out of it. Today's experience notwithstanding, but you know what I mean. So I think that the experience of the psychedelic experience can't be divorced from the neural pharmacology of it. I just don't think that's the right approach. But like you say, if someone manages to do it, more power to them. But I'd be very surprised if that could happen.
Right. And I think there's also in this renaissance, there's an increased appreciation of the cautionary elements, what can go wrong. Because if something like 90% of the United States has never used a psychedelic, and we are going to be approving them as medicines, we have to be ultra aware of the potential problems that emerge. Earlier in the conversation, you said that you don't like psychedelic cults. And I think that this is one of the things that tends to emerge, or sometimes these sort of religious movements, which can be good or they can be problematic. But have you had any experiences with psychedelic cults or interacted with any of these psychedelic religions outside of UDV?
Well, yeah, not really. A little bit. I mean, I've been to, this goes on in the ayahuasca, gringo ayahuasca territory all the time. They're dodgy shamans and a lot of often cult-like, sexual abuse, all of this kind of stuff. I think people get the impression that that's all it is, and that's really not. I think that's fairly rare. I think, in Peru, where I've had a lot of experiences with retreats, most curanderos are actually pretty decent people, and they don't have, this power-driven, impulse to dominate people or abuse people and so on. But it does go on. And Hamilton, I think it's not just psychedelics. I think any powerful spiritual technology, which is basically what these things are, meditation, yoga, all of these spiritual practices, if you get involved with them in these group type situations, there's often some power mad person, usually a man, not always, but who sees that as a path to power and dominance over people, because they're coming there deliberately to put themselves in a vulnerable situation. The whole idea of taking psychedelics in these group settings is to be able to open up and open yourself up on many levels. And that's what's necessary for the healing. So if there's someone who is, in a position of power and authority, that's an opportunity for them to, really abuse that position, and they don't have the the best interests of their clients at heart. So I guess the solution is know your curandero, or be careful. Don't just go on the internet and select the first one that comes up. Ask trusted friends, ask people that are experienced in this area, and to give you personal connections to someone that is ethical. And there are many out there. There are also many people that you wouldn't take it with on a bet, so it's tricky territory sometimes.
Did you ever have any interaction with the Temple of the True Inner Light, this DPT religion in New York?
I've not had any interactions with them. Are they still doing their thing?
Not quite the same way they once did.
Oh, no, I don't know. I mean, they must be one of the longest lived psychedelic cults around. I remember they were doing it in like the 60s, right?
They had a sort of unofficial offshoot of the Native American church that dates back, into the 60s, I believe. But yeah.
I have no connection with them. Have you?
Yes, yeah. I've talked with them quite a bit, and the leader of the group is a chemist, and he would synthesize various tryptamine psychedelics, and then they would use them in their communions. And it was a bona fide, and in some sense continues to be a bona fide religious group that worships synthetic psychedelics.
Well, it could be. I mean, there's no reason why it couldn't be. It's not that these things can't be used, responsibly, and maybe in a group like this. So you've got your chemist, and you've got people kind of like Shulgin's, coterie of people that would test his compounds out. You've got a group of experienced trippers, and they can try these things out, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's being a psychonaut. I long since gave up any ambitions to be a psychonaut in that sense. I don't have to take every drug that's out there. I prefer to work with the ones I know and get a deeper relationship with ayahuasca and mushrooms and DMT. Those are my main psychedelics for me personally.
So for you and your brother, there was no real interest in DET or DPT or those sorts of things?
Not particularly, no. I mean, I have had limited experience with them, for one thing. I mean, I've taken DET. I don't see anything that makes it any better than DMT. So again, from a just curiosity point of view, I am glad other people are doing that work. I hope they keep careful notes, and but I don't feel I have to do that.
Yeah. I can send you a paper. You might find it interesting. There was a chemist that just found a whole new group of tetrahydrobeta-carbolines that are very, very potent psychedelics. They're not naturally occurring, but they're pretty close to known beta-carbolines, and they're remarkably potent. So, yeah, there's so much work left to be done in this area, and I'm so glad that you've made all the contributions that you have.
Yeah, now that paper I would be very interested in.
I'll send it over.
Please send me that paper. Is he underground? He or she, whoever is it?
It's a woman at Northwestern University who's doing it very much above ground.
Interesting.
Paper didn't get much attention, and they're very easy to synthesize. I just synthesized one of them this week just to try to replicate her findings. And
they're 5-HT2A agonists?
Yes, very, very high affinity 2A agonists.
Very cool. I'd like to know about that.
Yeah, I'll send it to you. And
Okay.
you mentioned that you were trying to do fewer podcasts, so I really appreciate that you took the time to speak with me today.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I do try and do fewer podcasts, but I know you reach a lot of people, and so that's good. And thank you for letting me plug my conference and my academy and all that. And people can write to me if people can write to me at the best thing to do is write to me at connect@mckenna.academy is the best way to reach me. And we want to hear from people. And yeah, I'd appreciate if you put the links up on your website, and I'll send you some other material that will help. We've got some promotional, graphics, and I'll send you a couple papers that you might be interested in.
Oh,
Just
yeah. So I'll
personally.
put all that up,
Yeah.
and please send that
Yeah.
all along. Well, yeah. And thank you so much for everything that you've done. I really am a tremendous appreciator of your work.
Well, thank you so much, Hamilton. Me too. You have gone. I appreciate your work too. You have made your own contributions. Sometimes you go where angels fear to tread, and there needs to be somebody doing that. So, safe journeys in all dimensions, my friend.
All right. Have a good night, Dennis. Thank you so much.
Thank you.